48 hours of sustained Russian operations along three converging axes, and the Pokrovsk salient that Ukrainian forces had been holding for the better part of 8 months was operationally isolated. The two ground lines of communication that had been sustaining the defensive grouping inside the salient were under direct fire from Russian positions that had been advanced into firing range during the preceding week. The aerial resupply that Ukraine had been using to supplement the ground lines was being attrited by a Russian air defense screen that had been repositioned specifically to cover the approach corridors. Inside the salient, the Ukrainian defensive grouping was operating on stockpiles that the most credible open-source assessments put it somewhere between 3 and 5 days of sustained combat consumption for the heavier ammunition categories, and substantially less than that for the fuel required to maneuver armored vehicles. Every operational planner who has ever looked at an isolation problem knows what is supposed to happen next. The isolated force, denied resupply, consumes its stockpiles, becomes progressively less capable of resisting pressure, and is either reduced in place by sustained attack or accepts terms for withdrawal under conditions favorable to the encircling force. The mathematics of this are not complicated. They have been the operational reality of siege warfare for several thousand years, and the introduction of modern weapons has not changed the underlying logic. A force that cannot be resupplied is a force that is going to lose, on a timeline determined by its stockpile depth and its rate of consumption. The Pokrovsk salient did not lose, not on the timeline the Russian operational concept required, not in the way the Russian planning had assumed it would. And the reason for that, which is the analytically interesting part of this engagement and the part that I want to spend the next several minutes walking you through carefully, is not that the Ukrainian defenders were braver or more skilled or better equipped than the Russian forces attacking them. The reason is structural, and it tells us something important about how modern defensive operations are actually conducted by forces that have spent 3 years adapting to the specific operational environment they are fighting in. Let me start with what the Russian planning got right, because the analytical conversation around this engagement is going to be muddied by people who want to claim that the Russian operation was poorly conceived, and that reading is wrong in ways that will prevent anyone listening to it from understanding what actually happened. The Russian operation against the Pokrovsk salient was, in its operational concept, professionally sound. The salient itself was a feature of the front that had developed over months of contested fighting, with the Ukrainian defensive grouping holding terrain that projected into Russian-controlled territory in a way that made the salient inherently vulnerable to operations against its base. The two ground lines of communication that sustained the salient were the dominant feature of the operational problem. Anyone looking at a map of the area for 30 seconds could identify them as the load-bearing elements of the Ukrainian defensive posture, and the Russian planning cell that designed the isolation operation identified them correctly and designed the operation around their interdiction. The operation itself was executed with a level of coordination that the Russian military has not always demonstrated during this war. 3 converging axes, time to achieve the interdiction of both ground lines within a 48-hour window, pre-positioned artillery and rocket systems to cover the approach corridors, air defense repositioning to address the aerial resupply problem, a reserve component held back specifically to exploit the isolation once it was achieved, configured for the sustained reduction of the defensive grouping that was supposed to follow. The operation was not improvised. It was planned, rehearsed, and executed by Russian formations that had been preparing for it for at least 6 weeks, and the execution achieved its proximate objective, which was the interdiction of the ground lines, within roughly the timeline the planning had specified. Where the planning failed, and where the engagement that followed produced an outcome that genuinely surprised most of the analytical community watching the operation develop, was in its assumptions about what would happen inside the salient once the isolation was achieved. The Russian planning assumed that the Ukrainian defensive grouping, denied resupply, would behave the way isolated forces have behaved across military history. It would consume its stockpiles. It would degrade in capability. It would either accept reduction in place or attempt a breakout under conditions that the encircling force could exploit. None of those assumptions survived contact with what the Ukrainian defensive grouping actually did. Now, to understand what the Ukrainian grouping did, you have to understand something about how Ukrainian defensive operations have evolved over the 3 years of this war, and the evolution is not visible in any equipment count or order of battle. The evolution is in the texture of how Ukrainian formations actually consume the resources they have, and how they have learned to operate at consumption rates that any Western military planner would consider impossible. Pre-war Ukrainian doctrine, inherited substantially from the Soviet model, assumed combat consumption rates for ammunition and fuel that were consistent with the operational tempo of large-scale mechanized warfare. The assumption was that a defensive grouping in sustained combat would consume artillery ammunition at rates measured in hundreds of rounds per gun per day, would consume small arms ammunition at rates that required regular battalion-level resupply, and would consume fuel at rates determined by the operational requirement to keep armored vehicles ready for mobile defensive action and counterattack. Those consumption rates were not arbitrary. They reflected the doctrinal requirement to fight a particular kind of war, and the logistics architecture supporting Ukrainian forces was sized to those consumption rates. What has happened over 3 years of war, and what was happening inside the Pokrovsk salient at the operational level long before the Russian isolation operation began, is that Ukrainian formations have been progressively relearning how to fight at consumption rates that are a fraction of what their doctrine assumed. Not because they have chosen to, but because the available supply has forced them to, and because the operational reality of fighting under sustained Russian fire pressure has rewarded formations that can sustain defensive operations on less. The artillery ammunition that doctrine assumed would be available has not been available in those quantities for the better part of 2 years. The fuel that doctrine assumed would be available for routine maneuver has been rationed at levels that have forced Ukrainian commanders to develop a different relationship with the question of when armored vehicles get moved and what purposes the movement serves. The result is that by the time the Russian isolation operation closed the ground lines into the Pokrovsk salient, the Ukrainian defensive grouping inside was operating at consumption rates that the Russian planning had not modeled correctly, because the Russian planning had been modeling Ukrainian consumption against the doctrinal assumptions that Ukrainian forces had stopped operating under months earlier. The 3 to 5 days of stockpile depth that open source assessments were estimating was 3 to 5 days of stockpile depth at consumption rates that the Ukrainian grouping was no longer consuming at. The actual operational endurance at the consumption rates the grouping had been practicing for the preceding months in anticipation of exactly this kind of operation was substantially longer. That is the first variable that mattered, and it is the variable that anyone studying this engagement professionally has to start with, because it explains why the operational timeline that Russian planning had calibrated to a specific stockpile depletion did not produce the operational result that Russian planning had assumed it would produce. The stockpiles did not deplete on the timeline the planning required. The defensive grouping did not degrade on the timeline the planning required. And the Russian reserve component that had been positioned to exploit the depletion was now sitting in its assembly area, watching a salient that was supposed to be collapsing continue to function as a coherent defensive position. The second variable, and this is the one that produced the operational outcome that genuinely shocked the analytical community, was what the Ukrainian command did with the isolation itself once it became clear that the ground lines were not going to be reopened on any near-term timeline. The conventional response to an isolation situation, the response that Russian planning had assumed Ukraine would adopt, is to husband resources, minimize active operations, and hold defensive positions while higher headquarters works to reopen the lines of communication. That response is operationally sensible under most conditions. It is what the manuals teach. It is what most Western militaries would do under similar circumstances. And it is what the Russian planning had assumed Ukraine would do, because it is what Russian doctrine would have done in the same position. The Ukrainian command did something different. The Ukrainian command made the judgment, in the first 12 hours after the isolation was achieved, that the only way to make the isolation operationally untenable for the Russian forces conducting it was to attack the Russian positions that were producing the isolation from inside the salient that was supposed to be containing the Ukrainian grouping. Not a breakout, not a withdrawal, a sustained offensive operation conducted by an isolated force against the positions enforcing the isolation, on the calculation that the Russian forces conducting the isolation were themselves more vulnerable than they appeared, and that the political and operational pressure on the Russian command to maintain the isolation would create the conditions for the encircling force to make exactly the kind of mistake that an opponent with an information advantage could exploit. Now I want to take you inside the engagement at the level of one Ukrainian mechanized battalion during the third day of the operation, because the abstract description of what the Ukrainian command did only makes sense when you can see what the execution actually looked like at the working level. Picture a Ukrainian mechanized battalion, operating from positions roughly 4 kilometers inside the salient, with a battalion commander who has been monitoring the developing Russian dispositions for the preceding 72 hours through a reconnaissance picture that has been substantially better than anyone outside the salient would have expected, because the Ukrainian unmanned aerial systems operating inside the salient had been deliberately preserved from earlier engagement attempts and were now providing real-time observation of Russian positions at a level of resolution the Russian planning had not assumed Ukraine would have available. The battalion commander is a major, 3 rotations of combat experience, with a staff that has been working together for roughly 8 months, and that has developed the kind of working trust that allows decisions to be made at speed without the friction that newer formations would experience under the same conditions. He has been receiving the broader operational picture from brigade headquarters, and the picture is clear. The Russian forces interdicting the southern line of communication, which is the more important of the two from the perspective of the defensive grouping's sustainment, are positioned in a configuration that reflects the Russian assumption that they will be receiving the Ukrainian breakout attempt rather than conducting their own offensive operation against an enemy that is supposed to be running out of supplies. That assumption has produced a specific Russian disposition. The forward elements are configured for fires against breakout attempts, which is to say, they are oriented outward, away from their own rear, with their heavier weapons positioned to engage Ukrainian forces moving from the salient toward the Russian positions. The Russian reserve, which is positioned roughly 6 kilometers behind the forward elements, is configured for movement forward to reinforce the forward elements against the breakout, which is to say it is in an assembly area posture rather than a defensive posture, with its own vehicles not in prepared positions and its perimeter security oriented against the threat the Russian planning had assumed it would be facing. The battalion commander has the picture. He understands what it means. He understands that the Russian forces interdicting the southern line of communication are vulnerable, in a specific way, to an operation that approaches them from a direction they are not configured to defend against, conducted at a tempo their command cycle is not positioned to respond to. He has the resources to conduct that operation, because the Ukrainian command has authorized the commitment of the resources he needs, on the calculation that the operational value of breaking the isolation is worth more than the resources required to break it. The operation begins at first light. The battalion moves out of its positions inside the salient, in a direction that the Russian observation has not been monitoring as closely as it has been monitoring the obvious breakout corridor. The lead elements achieve contact with the Russian forward positions before the Russian command has registered that an attack is developing. The Russian forward elements, oriented for fires against a different threat axis, are unable to bring their heaviest weapons to bear within the window the Ukrainian assault requires, because the weapons are positioned facing the wrong direction, and the reorientation requires time the Russian commanders do not have. That is the moment. Not the destruction of the Russian forward elements, which happens over the following 2 hours, as the Ukrainian battalion exploits the disposition mismatch. The moment when a Russian battalion commander, sitting in his command post, watches an attack develop against his position from a direction his entire defensive posture had assumed would not produce an attack, conducted by an enemy his higher headquarters had assured him was running out of the resources required to conduct offensive operations. He is not failing. His soldiers are not failing. The information picture his command had been operating from was wrong, and the disposition that had been chosen based on that information picture is now the disposition that is producing his unit's destruction. He requests immediate reinforcement from the Russian reserve. The reserve commander in his assembly area 6 kilometers back has to spin up his unit from an assembly area posture to a movement posture, and the spin-up takes time. By the time the reserve is moving, the Ukrainian battalion has already passed through the position of the forward elements and is engaging the reserve assembly area from a direction the reserve had not been positioned to defend against. The reserve takes substantial damage during the spin-up, before it has cohered into a unit capable of effective defensive action. By the time the divisional headquarters above the Russian forces in this sector has registered what is happening and begun to issue orders to address it, the Ukrainian battalion has achieved its proximate objective, which is the dislocation of the Russian forces interdicting the southern line of communication, and the line itself is being reopened by Ukrainian engineering elements that had been positioned for exactly this contingency. Pull back from the battalion engagement and look at what this operation reveals about the structural relationship between operational planning and operational adaptation that the Russian military has been struggling with throughout this war. The Russian operational planning for the Pokrovsk isolation was professional, coherent, and based on assumptions about Ukrainian behavior that reflected what Ukrainian doctrine specified and what Ukrainian formations had done in earlier phases of the war. The assumptions were not stupid. They were the assumptions any competent planning cell would have generated based on the available evidence about how Ukrainian formations had operated previously. The problem is that Ukrainian formations had stopped operating that way, in ways that were not visible to outside observation, and the Russian planning was calibrated to a Ukrainian operational model that no longer corresponded to how Ukrainian forces were actually fighting. This is the pattern that runs through multiple Russian operational reverses across this war, and it is the pattern that anyone studying the war professionally has to internalize. The Russian planning system is competent at planning against the Ukrainian military it observed 18 months ago. It is consistently less competent at planning against the Ukrainian military that exists at the time the operation is actually being conducted, because the Russian planning system has not developed the institutional habit of continuously updating its assumptions about the adversary at the tempo the adversary is actually evolving at. The Ukrainian military has been adapting continuously, in ways large and small, for the entire duration of the war. The consumption rates I described earlier are one example. The disposition awareness inside the salient is another. The willingness to commit to a counteroffensive operation from inside an isolation is a third. Each of these adaptations is small individually. Cumulatively, they amount to a Ukrainian military that fights differently in 2026 than it fought in 2023, and the planning cells inside the Russian General Staff have not kept pace with the cumulative effect of those adaptations. Ukraine, by contrast, has built an operational culture that assumes the adversary is also adapting, and that builds operational concepts around exploiting the gap between what the adversary is currently doing and what the adversary's planning system thinks the friendly force is doing. The Pokrovsk operation from the Ukrainian side was specifically designed around the exploitation of a Russian planning assumption that Ukrainian planners had identified as outdated. The Russian forces would assume Ukraine was running out of supplies on a particular timeline. Ukraine would not be running out on that timeline. The Russian forces would assume Ukraine would either accept reduction in place or attempt a conventional breakout. Ukraine would conduct an offensive operation instead. Each Ukrainian decision was made with the explicit awareness that the Russian planning was operating from outdated assumptions, and the operational value of the Ukrainian decisions came from the gap between those assumptions and the operational reality. What this means for the broader question of how this war continues to develop. And I want to be careful here because this is the part of the analysis where overreach is easy, is that the Russian operational planning advantage that existed at the beginning of the war has been progressively eroded by the Ukrainian capacity to adapt faster than the Russian planning system can update its model of the Ukrainian adversary. The erosion is not visible in any single engagement. It accumulates across engagements, and it produces operational outcomes like Pokrovsk, where a Russian operation that was sound on its own terms produces a result the Russian planning had not anticipated because the planning was calibrated to an adversary that no longer exists. The Pokrovsk operation did not shock analysts because the operational mechanics were exotic. The mechanics were straightforward. It shocked analysts because the outcome contradicted the assumption, widely held outside Ukraine and inside the Russian planning system, that an isolated force operating at the stockpile depths Ukraine was operating at could not generate an offensive response of the kind that broke the isolation. That assumption was wrong, and it was wrong because it was based on an outdated model of the Ukrainian military that the Ukrainian military had stopped corresponding to. The lesson that travels beyond this specific engagement is that the operational planning advantage in a long war does not belong to the side with the best initial planning system. It belongs to the side that updates its model of the adversary at the tempo the adversary is actually evolving at, and that builds operational concepts around the gap between what the opposing planning system thinks is happening and what is actually happening. Ukraine has been doing this for 3 years. Russia, for reasons that are structural rather than personal, has been doing it less well. The cumulative effect of that difference is the engagements like Pokrovsk that get described as shocking, when in fact they are the predictable output of an asymmetric capacity for adaptation that has been compounding across the entire duration of the war. The shock is not in the operation. The shock is in the realization that the model the Russian planning was operating from had been wrong for long enough, that the operation it produced was always going to fail, and the only question was which specific engagement would be the one that demonstrated the failure publicly. Pokrovsk was that engagement. There will be others.